In the hushed corridors of Westminster Abbey, where kings have been crowned and buried for nearly 1,000 years, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The ancient stones that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties would soon echo with prayers that carried the weight of a nation's hopes and fears. As the first Sunday of Advent approached, King Charles III prepared to lead a ceremony that would mark not just the beginning of the Christmas season, but a moment that would define his reign and touch the hearts of millions around the world. The morning mist clung to the Thames as London awakened to a day that would be remembered in the pages of history. Inside the hallowed walls of the Abbey, candles flickered against Gothic arches, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of centuries past. But this was no ordinary service, and Charles was no ordinary monarch. What began as a traditional religious ceremony would become a profound journey of faith, duty, and the unbreakable bond between a king and his people. As the bells of Westminster began their ancient call to worship, few could have imagined that this solemn start to Advent would reveal truths about courage, sacrifice, and the enduring power of hope that would resonate far beyond the Abbey's walls. The morning sun struggled through the thick December clouds as Charles Windsor stood before the tall windows of Clarence House, watching London slowly come to life. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had waited 73 years to wear the crown that now rested heavily upon his shoulders. Today marked the first Sunday of Advent, and he would lead the ceremony at Westminster Abbey as King Charles III, a role he had prepared for his entire life, yet still felt the weight of its enormous responsibility. Margaret Thompson, his longtime private secretary, entered the room quietly, carrying a leather folder containing the final details for the day's service. She had worked with the royal family for over 20 years, but even she felt the significance of this particular morning. The king turned from the window, his face showing the thoughtful expression that had become familiar to those who worked closely with him. "Your Majesty, the final arrangements have been confirmed," Margaret said, her voice respectful but warm. "The Archbishop will meet you at the Great West Door at precisely 10:30. The congregation includes representatives from all the Commonwealth nations, as well as community leaders from across the United Kingdom." Charles nodded, accepting the folder and briefly reviewing the order of service. He had studied every detail multiple times, but the ritual of checking once more helped calm his nerves. This ceremony was more than a religious observance. It was an opportunity to connect with his people during a time of great change and uncertainty in the world. The drive from Clarence House to Westminster Abbey took only 15 minutes, but it felt like a journey through time itself. The streets were lined with people who had gathered despite the cold December morning, many holding small Union Jack flags and others carrying signs with messages of support. Charles waved from the window of his official car, seeing faces both young and old, all looking toward him with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and hope. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a theologian from Cambridge who had been invited to observe the ceremony, stood among the crowd near the Abbey's entrance. She had studied royal ceremonies for decades, but seeing the new king arrive for his first major religious service since his coronation filled her with a sense of witnessing history in the making. The weight of tradition was palpable, yet there was something fresh and immediate about this moment that she found deeply moving. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere was both solemn and electric with anticipation. The ancient walls, which had heard the prayers of kings and commoners for nearly 1,000 years, seemed to vibrate with the significance of the moment. The magnificent Gothic architecture rose toward heaven, its stone pillars reaching upward like prayers made manifest in rock and mortar. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, waited at the altar, his ceremonial robes catching the light that filtered through the Abbey's famous stained glass windows. Behind him, the choir of Westminster Abbey had taken their positions, their faces reflecting the gravity and honor of the occasion. These were voices that had sung for royal weddings, coronations, and state funerals, but today felt uniquely special as they prepared to usher in the Advent season under the leadership of their new sovereign. Lady Catherine Pemberton, a member of the royal household who had served the family for 3 generations, watched from her seat near the front of the abbey. Her grandmother had attended King George VI's coronation. Her mother had been present at Queen Elizabeth II's wedding, and now she was witnessing King Charles III's first major ceremonial act as monarch. The continuity of tradition was something she felt deeply, connecting her not just to the royal family, but to the very fabric of British history. As 10:30 approached, the great doors of Westminster Abbey opened, and King Charles III entered, walking slowly down the nave as the organ began to play. The music filled the vast space, echoing off the ancient stones and rising to the vaulted ceiling high above. Every step he took was measured and deliberate, carrying the weight of ceremony and the expectations of a nation watching his every move. The congregation rose as one, their faces turned toward their king as he made his way to the altar. Among them was James Mitchell, a young father from Manchester who had driven down with his family specifically to witness this historic moment. He held his 7-year-old daughter Emma's hand as she stared in wonder at the pageantry unfolding before her eyes. For James, this was about more than politics or tradition. It was about being part of something larger than himself, something that connected him to his ancestors and to future generations yet to come. Sister Mary Catherine, a nun from a nearby convent who had been invited to represent the Catholic community, found herself deeply moved by the universality of the moment. Though the ceremony was Anglican, the themes of hope, renewal, and spiritual preparation that marked the beginning of Advent were shared by Christians across all denominations. She saw in King Charles's measured steps toward the altar a reflection of every believer's journey toward faith and understanding. The light streaming through the abbey's windows seemed to intensify as the king reached the altar, as if nature itself was blessing this moment of spiritual and temporal authority coming together. The archbishop stepped forward to greet his sovereign, and in that simple gesture, centuries of English history and religious tradition converged in a single, powerful instant. Dr. Robert Sterling, a historian from Oxford who had been granted permission to document the ceremony, observed from his position near the choir stalls. He had written extensively about the relationship between the monarchy and the Church of England, but seeing it enacted in real time gave him a new appreciation for the living, breathing nature of these ancient traditions. This was not merely a performance or a relic of the past, but a vital connection between the crown and the spiritual life of the nation. As the opening hymn began, the voices of the congregation joined with the professional choir, creating a sound that seemed to fill not just the abbey, but the very air of London itself. The music carried through the open doors and out into the streets, where crowds of people stood listening, many singing along with tears in their eyes. This was their king, their ceremony, their moment of shared faith and national identity. The first reading was from the book of Isaiah, chosen specifically for its themes of preparation and hope. As the words echoed through the abbey, Charles stood with his head bowed, reflecting on the enormous responsibility that rested upon his shoulders. He thought of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had carried this burden with such grace for over 70 years, and he prayed for the wisdom and strength to follow in her footsteps while making the role uniquely his own. Among the congregation, retired teacher Patricia Williams clutched her prayer book tightly. She had taught Sunday school for 40 years and had always emphasized to her students the importance of Advent as a time of preparation and anticipation. Seeing her king participate in this same spiritual preparation filled her with a deep sense of pride and hope for the future of the country she loved so dearly. The ceremony continued with prayers for the Commonwealth, for peace throughout the world, and for wisdom for all those in positions of leadership. Each prayer was carefully chosen to reflect not just religious tradition, but the contemporary challenges facing the United Kingdom and the wider world. Climate change, social inequality, and international conflicts were all acknowledged in the sacred space, bringing ancient faith into dialogue with modern concerns. Young Timothy Chun, a student at Westminster School who sang in the Abbey choir, felt the weight of history as his voice joined with others in the traditional Advent carols. His family had immigrated to Britain from Hong Kong, and standing in this most English of settings while participating in this most British of ceremonies, he felt a profound sense of belonging and connection to his adopted homeland. As the first part of the ceremony drew to a close, King Charles stepped forward to light the first candle of the Advent wreath. The small flame flickered bravely in the vast space of the Abbey, a symbol of hope beginning to grow in a world often marked by darkness and uncertainty. The simple act of lighting a candle became a moment of profound symbolism, representing not just the beginning of the Christmas season, but the dawn of a new era in British history. The congregation watched in reverent silence as their king performed this most human and humble of acts. Here was a man who commanded vast wealth and influence, who lived in palaces and was served by hundreds of staff, and yet in this moment he was simply a believer lighting a candle and preparing his heart for the coming of Christmas. The image would remain with many of those present for the rest of their lives, a reminder that even kings must humble themselves before their Creator. As the flame caught and grew stronger, casting its warm light across the king's face, the first part of this historic Advent ceremony came to an end. But already, those present could sense that something extraordinary was unfolding, something that would touch not just their own lives, but the life of the nation itself. The journey through Advent had begun, and King Charles III was leading them all toward a Christmas that promised to be unlike any other. The second portion of the ceremony began with a procession that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. Representatives from across the Commonwealth walked slowly down the nave of Westminster Abbey, each carrying symbols of their homeland and their faith. This was King Charles's vision made manifest, a recognition that the modern monarchy must embrace the diversity of the peoples it serves while honoring the traditions that bind them together. Amara Okafor led the procession, carrying the flag of Nigeria. She was a doctor who had moved to London 5 years earlier and had become deeply involved in community health initiatives in South London. As she walked past the tombs of ancient English kings and queens, she thought about how far the Commonwealth had evolved from its imperial origins. Today, she was not a subject of a distant empire, but a citizen participating in a shared ceremony of faith and renewal. Behind her walked David Nakamura from Canada, a teacher from Toronto whose grandfather had served in the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II. He carried a small maple leaf flag alongside a Christian cross, symbols that for him represented both his national identity and his personal faith. The Abbey's grandeur impressed him, but what moved him more was the sense of connection he felt to people from around the world who shared his Commonwealth citizenship. The Archbishop of Canterbury watched this procession with deep satisfaction. He had worked closely with King Charles to design this ceremony, and they had both insisted that it reflect the true diversity of the modern Commonwealth. This was not about nostalgia for empire, but about building bridges across cultures and continents in service of shared values of faith, democracy, and human dignity. From her seat near the altar, Professor Sarah Henderson of the University of Sydney observed the ceremony with the eyes of a constitutional scholar. She had flown to London specifically to witness this event, understanding its significance for the future of the Commonwealth. The way King Charles was choosing to exercise his role as head of the Commonwealth would set important precedents for decades to come, and this ceremony suggested a monarch who understood the need to adapt ancient institutions to modern realities. The reading from Scripture was delivered by Grace Patel, a young woman from Birmingham whose parents had emigrated from India in the 1970s. Her voice carried clearly through the Abbey as she read from the Gospel of Luke, the familiar words of preparation and hope taking on new meaning in this multicultural setting. For Grace, standing at the lectern where so many historic speeches had been delivered, this was a moment of profound personal and communal significance. King Charles listened to the reading with visible emotion. He had spent years preparing for this moment, traveling throughout the Commonwealth realms, learning about different cultures and traditions, understanding that his role required him to be not just King of England, but a symbol of unity for peoples spread across 6 continents. The diversity of faces before him in Westminster Abbey represented the future he hoped to help create. Among the congregation, retired diplomat Sir Anthony Blackwood reflected on the changes he had witnessed during his 40-year career in the Foreign Office. He had served in embassies from Nairobi to New Delhi, from Ottawa to Canberra, and he understood better than most the delicate balance required to maintain Commonwealth unity while respecting national sovereignty. This ceremony represented a masterful piece of symbolic diplomacy, acknowledging diversity while celebrating shared heritage. The music for this portion of the service had been specially commissioned, blending traditional Anglican hymns with melodies from across the Commonwealth. The Abbey Choir was joined by musicians from Jamaica, Australia, South Africa, and Malaysia, creating a sound that was both familiar and entirely new. Dr. Michael Thompson, the Abbey's director of music, had spent months preparing for this moment, working with composers and performers from around the world to create something worthy of the occasion. Sitting in the front row of the congregation, High Commissioner Patricia Williams from Barbados felt a complex mixture of emotions. Her country had only recently become a republic, removing Queen Elizabeth II as head of state, yet here she was participating in a ceremony led by the new king. The relationship between Barbados and the Crown had evolved, but the connections forged through shared history and values remained strong. This ceremony acknowledged that evolution while celebrating continuing friendship. The sermon was delivered by Archbishop Thabo Makgoba from South Africa, whose presence on this most English of stages represented the transformation of both the Anglican Communion and the Commonwealth itself. His words spoke of reconciliation and renewal, of learning from the past while building a better future. He challenged those present to see Advent not just as preparation for Christmas, but as a call to work for justice and peace in their own communities and around the world. Young Marcus Thompson from Manchester listened to the Archbishop's words with growing excitement. At 19, he was the youngest person in his family to attend a royal ceremony, and he found himself deeply moved by the message of hope and responsibility. The Archbishop spoke directly to young people like him, challenging them to see themselves as inheritors of a great tradition, but also as agents of positive change in a world that desperately needed their energy and idealism. The prayers that followed were offered in multiple languages, reflecting the linguistic diversity of the Commonwealth. Hindi, French, Arabic, Swahili, and Mandarin joined with English in petitions for peace, prosperity, and wisdom. This was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the ceremony, acknowledging that the Commonwealth's strength lay not in linguistic uniformity, but in its ability to embrace and celebrate difference. Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid, a professor of Islamic studies at King's College London, had been invited to offer a prayer for interfaith understanding. While the ceremony remained firmly Christian in its theological framework, the inclusion of voices from other faith traditions reflected King Charles's long-standing commitment to religious dialogue and mutual respect. Her presence in Westminster Abbey sent a powerful message about the inclusive nature of the modern British state. The lighting of the second Advent candle was performed jointly by King Charles and 12-year-old Priya Sharma from Leicester, whose essay about hope and community had won a national competition organized by the Church of England. As the king and the young girl lit the candle together, the symbolism was unmistakable. The future of the Commonwealth depended on the partnership between experience and youth, tradition and innovation, wisdom and energy. The congregation watched in fascinated silence as these two figures, separated by more than 60 years of age and representing vastly different stations in life, worked together to kindle the flame of the second candle. Priya's hands shook slightly with nervousness, but King Charles steadied her with a gentle smile, and together they brought light to the Advent wreath. The moment was captured by photographers from around the world, and the image would later become iconic, symbolizing the democratic and inclusive vision that Charles hoped to embody as monarch. From his position in the choir stalls, Canon David Richardson reflected on the theological significance of what was unfolding before him. For 30 years he had served parishes across England, but this ceremony represented something entirely new in his experience. The traditional framework of Anglican worship was being expanded to include voices and perspectives that would have been unimaginable in previous generations. Yet the core message remained unchanged: the call to prepare one's heart for the coming of Christ. The musical offering that concluded this portion of the ceremony was a specially commissioned piece that wove together traditional Christmas carols with melodies from across the Commonwealth. The Aboriginal didgeridoo blended with Scottish bagpipes, Caribbean steel drums harmonized with Welsh harps, and Indian tabla provided rhythm for Canadian fiddles. The result was unlike anything ever heard in Westminster Abbey, a sound that somehow managed to honor tradition while pointing boldly toward the future. As the last notes faded into the Abbey's ancient stones, King Charles stood to address the congregation directly. His words were brief but carefully chosen, acknowledging the honor of serving as head of the Commonwealth while recognizing the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. He spoke of his mother's legacy of service and dedication, but also of his hope that the Commonwealth could continue to evolve and grow stronger through mutual respect and shared commitment to human dignity. The audience that heard these words included prime ministers and presidents, but also teachers and students, doctors and farmers, young and old, representing every walk of life and every corner of the Commonwealth. They listened with rapt attention as their king outlined his vision for a Commonwealth that could serve as a model for international cooperation in an increasingly divided world. Among those listening was 15-year-old Jennifer Wong from Vancouver, who had traveled to London with her youth group specifically to attend this ceremony. As she heard King Charles speak about the importance of young people in shaping the future, she felt a surge of pride and responsibility. This was her Commonwealth too, and she was being called to help build something better for the generations that would follow. The second portion of the ceremony concluded with a blessing offered jointly by religious leaders from across the Commonwealth, their different accents and traditions creating a tapestry of faith that somehow managed to be both diverse and unified. As their voices rose together in prayer, the candles on the Advent wreath flickered bravely, symbols of hope in a world that desperately needed the light of compassion and understanding. The journey through Advent was continuing, and with each moment, those present felt more deeply connected to something larger than themselves, something that promised to transform not just the Christmas season, but the years to come. The third movement of the ceremony began as King Charles approached the tomb of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, which lay in the George VI Memorial Chapel adjacent to the main abbey. This was perhaps the most emotionally charged moment of the entire service, as the new monarch paused to honor the woman who had defined the British monarchy for over 7 decades. The congregation fell into complete silence, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing a profoundly personal moment being played out on the most public of stages. Lady Susan Hussey, who had served as lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth II for over 60 years, watched from her seat with tears streaming down her face. She had known Charles since he was a young prince, had watched him grow from an uncertain boy into the thoughtful man who now stood as king. The weight of tradition and expectation that rested upon his shoulders was something she understood better than almost anyone, having witnessed firsthand the sacrifices that royal duty demanded. The Archbishop of Canterbury joined King Charles at the tomb, and together they offered a prayer for all those who had gone before them in service to the nation. The words echoed through the abbey with particular poignancy, as many in the congregation reflected on their own losses and the continuing cycle of life and death that touches every human being, regardless of their station. This was not just a royal mourning a beloved mother, but a son honoring a parent who had shaped his understanding of duty and service. Dr. Margaret Foster, the royal historian who had written extensively about the transition of power within the British monarchy, observed this moment with professional fascination and personal emotion. She understood that what she was witnessing was not just ceremonial, but constitutionally significant. The peaceful transfer of authority from one generation to the next was a cornerstone of constitutional monarchy, and this simple act of remembrance helped legitimize Charles's reign while honoring his predecessor. From the tomb, the procession moved to the coronation chair, the ancient seat where English monarchs had been crowned for over 700 years. King Charles did not sit upon the chair. This was not a coronation, but his presence near this most sacred symbol of royal authority carried deep meaning for those who understood the layers of history embedded in every stone of Westminster Abbey. Young Thomas Hartwell, a history student from Cambridge who had won a competition to attend the ceremony, stared at the coronation chair with awe. He had studied the medieval period extensively and knew that this simple wooden seat had supported kings and queens through centuries of triumph and tragedy. To see King Charles standing beside it, not as a distant figure from a textbook, but as a living participant in a continuing story, made history feel immediate and alive in a way he had never experienced before. The reading for this portion of the service came from the book of Ecclesiastes, the famous passage about there being a time for everything under heaven. The words took on special significance in this setting, surrounded by monuments to monarchs who had ruled for brief seasons or long decades, who had faced war and peace, prosperity, and crisis. King Charles listened with visible concentration, understanding that his own time had come and that history would judge how well he used the opportunity he had been given. Canon Eleanor Pembroke, who had served Westminster Abbey for 15 years, had chosen this particular reading after extensive consultation with biblical scholars and royal historians. The theme of time and season seemed perfect for an Advent service that was also marking the passage from one reign to another. The eternal cycle of preparation and fulfillment that marked the Christian calendar found its parallel in the continuing story of the British monarchy. The music that accompanied this reflection was provided by the string quartet from the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, their instruments creating haunting melodies that seemed to give voice to the very stones of the abbey. The sound wound its way around the columns and arches, creating an atmosphere of deep contemplation that encouraged everyone present to reflect on their own relationship with time, duty, and mortality. Among the congregation, retired General Sir James Wellington found himself thinking about his own years of military service and the many times he had sworn oaths of allegiance to different monarchs. He had served under Queen Elizabeth II for most of his career, but had also taken a new oath when King Charles ascended to the throne. This ceremony helped him understand the continuity that bound these different moments together, the way personal loyalty and institutional duty could transcend individual personalities and circumstances. The moment that everyone had been waiting for came when King Charles stepped forward to light the third Advent candle. But before he did so, he spoke briefly about the nature of preparation and the importance of learning from the past while remaining open to the future. His words were carefully chosen to honor tradition, while acknowledging that the monarchy must continue to evolve if it was to remain relevant to contemporary British society. Princess and the king's sister watched from her seat in the front row as her brother performed this simple but symbolically rich act. She had known Charles her entire life, had seen him struggle with the burdens of being heir to the throne, and now she witnessed him fully embracing the role he had been born to fulfill. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. He was no longer the Prince of Wales waiting for his time to come, but a king confidently leading his people into the future. The flame of the third candle seemed brighter than the previous two, casting its light not just on the Advent wreath, but on the faces of everyone near the altar. Dr. Richard Harrington, a theologian from Durham University who had been invited to observe the ceremony for a book he was writing about monarchy and religion, noted how this simple act of lighting a candle managed to combine the most ancient of human rituals with the most sophisticated of contemporary ceremonials. As the light grew stronger, King Charles began to speak about the challenges facing not just Britain, but the world in the 21st century. Climate change, economic inequality, social division, and international conflict all required leadership that could inspire hope while acknowledging hard realities. His words were not partisan political statements, but rather a call to moral purpose that transcended party boundaries and spoke to fundamental human values. The congregation listened with growing attention as their king outlined his understanding of the role that constitutional monarchy could play in addressing these challenges. He spoke of the crown as a symbol of unity that could bring people together across political divides, of the importance of public service that put the common good ahead of personal gain, and of the need for institutions that could provide stability and continuity in times of rapid change. Mrs. Catherine Mills, a retired nurse from Liverpool who had traveled to London specifically to attend this ceremony, found herself deeply moved by the king's words. She had spent 40 years caring for others, and she recognized in his speech the same commitment to service that had motivated her own career. This was not just a king speaking to his subjects, but one human being calling others to join him in work that truly mattered. The prayer that followed was offered for all those who carried the burden of leadership, not just in government, but in communities, families, and institutions throughout the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. King Charles knelt as this prayer was offered, demonstrating his understanding that even kings must humble themselves before higher authority and acknowledge their need for divine guidance in fulfilling their responsibilities. Young Sarah Chun, a theology student from Edinburgh who had been selected to represent Scottish universities at the ceremony, watched the king kneel with a mixture of admiration and surprise. She had grown up with a Republican sentiment, questioning the relevance of monarchy in modern society, but seeing the king's obvious humility and genuine commitment to service was causing her to reconsider her assumptions about the institution he represented. The musical interlude that followed featured the world premiere of a composition specially written for this ceremony by Sir John Taverner's former student, Maria Rodriguez. The piece combined traditional Anglican choral music with contemporary harmonies that seemed to capture both the weight of history and the hope of renewal that characterized this moment in British royal history. The Abbey Choir's performance was flawless, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed to mirror the breathing of the ancient building itself. As the music concluded, Archbishop Justin Welby stepped forward to deliver a blessing that had been specially crafted for this unique moment in the life of the nation. His words acknowledged the grief of losing a beloved queen while celebrating the hope that came with a new reign committed to service and renewal. He spoke of Advent as a time of waiting and preparation, but also as a season of active engagement with the challenges and opportunities that God placed before his people. The congregation responded with a collective amen that seemed to echo not just through Westminster Abbey, but through the very foundations of British society. This was more than religious ritual. It was a moment of national recommitment to values and principles that had sustained the country through centuries of change and challenge. The weight of history was palpable, but so was the sense of possibility for the future. As the third portion of the ceremony drew to a close, King Charles remained standing near the Advent wreath, its three flames now burning brightly in the ancient abbey. The light they cast seemed to illuminate not just the immediate surroundings, but the path forward for a monarchy and a nation preparing to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The king's face showed both the burden and the privilege of his position, a man who understood that he had been called to serve something greater than himself. The silence that followed was pregnant with meaning, a moment of collective reflection on what had been witnessed and what lay ahead. 3 candles now burned on the Advent wreath, and with each flame that had been kindled, the sense of anticipation and hope had grown stronger. The ceremony was building towards something significant, and everyone present could feel the weight of history and the promise of the future converging in this most sacred of spaces. The fourth movement of the ceremony began with an unexpected departure from the traditional order of service. King Charles stepped away from the altar and walked directly into the congregation, moving among the people who had gathered to witness this historic moment. This was not part of the planned ceremony, but rather a spontaneous decision that would later be seen as defining the character of his reign. The security detail tensed momentarily, but the king's calm confidence reassured them as he began what would become known as the Walk Among the People. Mrs. Dorothy Thompson, an 85-year-old woman from Yorkshire who had traveled to London despite her arthritis because she felt this ceremony was too important to miss, suddenly found herself face-to-face with her king. He paused beside her wheelchair, leaned down, and spoke quietly about her service as a wartime nurse during the final years of World War II. The conversation lasted only a moment, but the dignity and respect with which he treated this elderly woman sent a powerful message to everyone watching. Behind her, Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a Syrian refugee who had become a British citizen just 2 years earlier, waited nervously as the king approached. Ahmed had fled his homeland after his hospital was bombed, and he now worked as a volunteer coordinator for refugee services in Birmingham. When King Charles reached him, the conversation was brief but profound. The king thanked him for his service to his new homeland and asked about his family, showing a personal interest that moved Ahmed to tears. The Archbishop of Canterbury watched this unscripted moment with growing admiration. He had worked closely with King Charles to plan every detail of the ceremony, but this spontaneous decision to walk among the congregation showed a pastoral instinct that no amount of planning could have anticipated. It was exactly the kind of gesture that could transform a formal religious service into a moment of genuine human connection. Young Lucy MacDonald, a 10-year-old girl from Glasgow who had come to London with her scout troop, clutched her handmade card tightly as the king approached their section. She had drawn a picture of Westminster Abbey with the words, "Thank you for taking care of us," written in careful childish script. When King Charles knelt to her level to accept the card, the image was captured by dozens of cameras and would later appear on front pages around the world, symbolizing the accessibility and warmth that he hoped would characterize his reign. The conversation between the king and the scout group lasted several minutes, during which Charles asked about their activities and their hopes for the future. Scout leader Jennifer Park watched in amazement as the most formal man in Britain sat cross-legged on the floor of Westminster Abbey, listening with genuine interest to 10-year-olds describing their environmental projects and community service activities. It was a sight that would have been unimaginable with previous monarchs, yet felt completely natural in this moment. As the king continued his walk through the congregation, he encountered Father Michael O'Brien, an Irish priest who ran a homeless shelter in East London. Their conversation touched on the growing problem of homelessness in the capital and the king's long-standing commitment to charitable work addressing housing issues. Father O'Brien later described feeling that he was speaking not to a distant monarch, but to a fellow servant who understood the challenges facing Britain's most vulnerable citizens. Near the back of the abbey, the king stopped to speak with Dr. Priya Patel, a young doctor who had worked on the front lines during the COVID-19 pandemic. She had lost colleagues to the virus and had herself battled severe illness before returning to work. The king's acknowledgement of her sacrifice and dedication brought tears not just to her eyes, but to those of many others who were watching this extraordinary interaction unfold. The congregation watched in fascination as their king moved among them like a pastor tending to his flock. This was not the distant figure on postage stamps and coins, but a man who clearly understood that his role required him to be accessible to and interested in the lives of ordinary people. The formal barriers that typically surrounded royal ceremonies seemed to dissolve as genuine human connections were made in this most sacred of settings. Professor David Sterling from Oxford University found himself in conversation with the king about his research into sustainable energy systems. Charles's knowledge and passion for environmental issues was well known, but experiencing his intellectual curiosity firsthand was remarkable. The conversation ranged from technical details about solar panel efficiency to broader questions about how to motivate social change, demonstrating the king's ability to engage seriously with complex policy issues. When King Charles reached the section where Commonwealth representatives were seated, he spent considerable time in conversation with High Commissioner Grace Adiolu from Ghana. Their discussion touched on trade relationships, educational exchanges, and the ongoing evolution of the Commonwealth Partnership. Watching from nearby, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was struck by the King's detailed knowledge of current issues facing different Commonwealth nations and his genuine commitment to strengthening these relationships. The musical accompaniment to this unprecedented royal walkabout was provided by the Abbey's organist, who improvised gentle variations on traditional hymns, creating a soundtrack that enhanced rather than distracted from the conversations taking place throughout the congregation. The music seemed to wrap around the individual encounters, binding them together into a coherent whole that felt both spontaneous and somehow inevitable. As the king made his way back toward the altar, he paused at the section reserved for military veterans. Sergeant Major William Brooks, who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq, found himself describing his transition to civilian life and his work with a veterans support organization. The king's questions were informed and sympathetic, clearly drawing on his extensive work with military charities and his understanding of the challenges faced by those who had served their country in combat. The final conversation of the King's Walk was with Sister Catherine Mary, a Benedictine nun whose order ran a food bank in Newcastle. Her work with families struggling with poverty had given her deep insights into the social challenges facing modern Britain, and she was struck by the King's obvious familiarity with these issues and his commitment to addressing them through his charitable work and public advocacy. When King Charles returned to the altar, the atmosphere in Westminster Abbey had been completely transformed. What had begun as a formal religious ceremony had become something much more intimate and personal. The traditional barriers between monarch and subjects had been temporarily dissolved, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and mutual respect that surprised even those who had organized the event. The lighting of the fourth Advent candle took on deeper meaning after this extraordinary interaction with the congregation. As King Charles and a representative group of those he had spoken with gathered around the Advent wreath, the flame they kindled together seemed to symbolize not just the approaching Christmas season, but the building of a new kind of relationship between the crown and the people it served. The prayer that followed was offered not just by the Archbishop, but by voices from throughout the congregation. Military veterans, healthcare workers, teachers, students, immigrants, and citizens whose families had lived in Britain for generations all added their voices to a collective petition for wisdom, justice, and peace. The effect was profound, creating a sense that this was not just a royal ceremony, but a national moment of spiritual reflection and recommitment. Dr. Sarah Williams, a sociologist from the London School of Economics who was studying the role of ritual in modern society, realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in the history of British royal ceremonies. The traditional hierarchical structure had been temporarily suspended, replaced by something more democratic and inclusive while still maintaining the essential dignity and significance of the occasion. As the fourth candle burned brightly on the Advent wreath, joined now by its three companions, the light seemed to illuminate not just the altar, but the entire abbey. The faces of those present showed a mixture of surprise, joy, and hope that reflected the unexpected nature of what they had experienced. This was not the ceremony they had expected, but it was exactly what many of them hadn't known they needed. The congregation sang the closing hymn of this section with unusual enthusiasm, their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to express the sense of unity and purpose that had emerged from the king's unprecedented walk among them. The words of the traditional Advent hymn took on new meaning after the personal encounters that had just taken place, speaking of preparation and anticipation that felt immediate and relevant rather than abstract and distant. As the music faded, King Charles stood once again at the altar, but the distance between him and his people had been permanently shortened. The fourth candle continued to burn, its light a testament to the power of personal connection and authentic leadership in an age often characterized by division and mistrust. The ceremony was approaching its climax, but the foundation had been laid for something that promised to extend far beyond this single morning in Westminster Abbey. The silence that fell over the congregation was different from the formal quiet that had marked earlier portions of the service. This was the silence of people who had been genuinely moved by what they had witnessed, who understood that they had participated in something that might well be remembered as a turning point in the history of the British monarchy. The fourth candle burned on, its flame steady and bright, pointing toward the conclusion of this remarkable Advent ceremony and the beginning of what promised to be a very different kind of reign.